Buenos dias. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate. It is a real honor, especially for someone who is not a specialist in Spanish cultural history. I would like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Deborah Mero, a pioneer researching women patrons in the 1970s. As we've just heard, the Prado has been a leader, mounting exhibitions demonstrating women artists' contributions to the Renaissance. But women had an impact on artistic production and reception in other ways, including patronage and collecting. Women were also viewers and, moreover, expressed opinions, although not in treatises on art history. Museums now look to include a wider range of voices, and here too the Prado is in the forefront with its Protagonistas femeninas initiative. Although the modernist definition of the artist as an inspired genius working to his own rhythm all but ignores it, patronage, we well know, played a large role in Renaissance artistic production. Before markets grew, individuals and corporate bodies, male and female, hired artists to make most things we see on museum walls. Other speakers will address specifics concerning the Prado collection, so I'll begin with an example from elsewhere, a painting that is also a document which highlights some issues that I shall consider regarding the stories that museums tell. With so much to see in the Louvre in Paris, you may easily miss a side gallery amongst those displaying its wealth of Italian art. If you find it, a horizontally oriented group of small paintings might not catch your eye. But if they did, and you read the label, you'd probably not linger, as probably the chances are that the artist's name, Niccolò da Foligno, wouldn't mean much. But if you looked, you might not pay attention to all the details in these small illustrations of episodes from Christ's Passion, especially the barely legible inscription on the cartouche supported by angels at left. And if you did look at it and you were curious, it is in Latin and hard to decipher. The Louvre website absolutely doesn't help, dismissing it as an inscription très longue. Luckily, Catherine King, scholar of Italian women art patrons, has done it for us. The noble Donna Brigida, now dead, willed that this work be painted, a spectacle extremely pleasing to God. If you seek to know the author's name, it is Niccolò l'Alunno of Foligno. In 1492, he put the finishing touches. But who is the more worthy of merit, I ask you, critical reader, since Brigida gave the commission and he the executing hand? I think we know how art museums respond. Museums display works made by executing hands, that is, artists. The inscription states that a viewer might be curious to know the author's name, while recognizing that he was not the only one involved. Museum visitors are conditioned to want to know an artist's name and biography, for he is presumed to be the party responsible for what is on view. This conceptualization arose in the Renaissance itself, when, in the 1550s and 60s, Giorgio Vasari wrote what is regarded as the first systematic history of art in the form of a series of artists' biographies. Collectively, they present art as created through the inspiration and effort of masters, Perhaps an oversimplification, as Vasari is not one-dimensional. However, he propagated the concept of the artist's genius, leading later to ideas like l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, which decreed that anything regarded as extrinsic to the work itself was irrelevant. I'll insist with Brigida that the Renaissance patron is not extrinsic. Vasari knew this, in fact, acknowledging the linked investment of patron and artist in the end product that reflected the honor of both, honor or reputation being a key Renaissance preoccupation. Vasari lamented that patrons did not always make the best choice of artist, so patronage has sometimes been constructed as limiting an artist's creative freedom. Well, without patrons, artists had to risk the whims of the market. Take your choice. Do issues arise concerning women when everything in a museum is presumed to be art, regardless of the different ways objects were regarded when made? Producing today's masterpieces was not the sole reason why artists made objects on museum walls. Brigida's statement alludes to other reasons for patronage in this era, that good works please God. Recall that patronage, the word, extends beyond art, describing a complex of relationships permeating social, economic, political, and religious aspects of Renaissance life. Like her peers, male and female, Brigida hoped her commission would mitigate the possibly shady aspects of her merchant husband's work on their chances for salvation. At this point, you may well be thinking, big deal. Why should we care about Brigida's claims for a modest work made for a provincial Italian town? Well, the Louvre displays only part of her commission, the portion of an altarpiece known as a predella, small narrative scenes running along the bottom. The Prado has many altarpieces, among them this one painted by Fra Angelico for the San Domenico Monastery in Fiesole, near Florence, complete with its predella. Often when monasteries sold works, they were cut up to sell to different buyers. This altarpiece remained intact and was purchased as a diplomatic gift for the Duke of Lerma, and for a time served again as an altarpiece installed in a chapel of the Descalzas Reales, possibly through the agency of some women in the household of Queen Margherita, where it stayed until the Prado director bought it for the museum in 1861. When you see the rest of Brigida's commission, you get a better sense of her expectations. A large polyptych with numerous panels in a specially crafted and gilded frame indicated to God and to viewers her large expense. Valuable materials, not just artistry, were important components. Such altarpieces are, moreover, specially planned for particular locations. Recall the question about whose contribution was more significant, patron or artist? With the assertion that the executing hand provided the finishing touches, the patron's role goes beyond payment to include ideation. The altarpiece presents an encapsulated Christian history, illustrating Christ's birth, death, and resurrection, supported by relevant prophets, theologians, and saints of local and doctrinal significance, together creating something unique. The main portion, incidentally, also made a trip to Paris. Napoleon pilfered hundreds of artworks in his project to unite great masterpieces in Paris. Ironically, The Louvre wing, in which Nicolas Predella hangs today, bears the name of Napoleon's agent in this, Dominique Vivant-Denon, who selected the complete altarpiece for confiscation in 1810. So Brigida's commission was deemed sufficiently important to merit inclusion with other expressions of human genius in the museum aggrandizing Napoleon. After the emperor's defeat, the main part returned to Foligno, but the predella remained. We can now only imagine the complete work once gracing Brigida's chapel. The history of this altarpiece and its presence in different locations indicates just one of the problems encountered in studying women patrons. At first, historians simply didn't notice women. Frances Haskell's magisterial study of 1963, at the center of this slide, investigated patronage and collecting by select male elites, especially those demonstrating perspicacity in choosing artists who would achieve fame, while also preternaturally predicting what future generations would value, thereby setting the standard by which art patronage is judged. Other scholars insisted that evidence to support women's patronage and collecting just didn't exist, citing their lack of property rights and inability to act independently in economic matters. But as the book jackets on the screen now amply demonstrate, scholars, including some on this symposium's program, have unearthed extensive documentary sources validating women's participation. Researchers have learned where to seek women's voices, and we can assert unequivocally that women commission work by artists considered great masters today. Yes. But I hope this is not the end of the story, and I would like to propose some additional themes to explore. We must query why women's roles are still ignored or de-emphasized. Some reasons are simply sexist, reflecting the wider culture. Others hinge on a lack of value assigned to the objects many women preferred. Museum organization, moreover, because of the expertise required for the care of collections, separates objects that may once have been together into different departments: paintings, sculpture, prints and drawings, metalwork, or even entirely different museums for textiles, furniture, porcelain, manuscripts, jewelry, making it even more difficult to highlight a patron or collector's role. Still, other explanations reflect unexamined value judgments. A distinguished French historian praised Francis I's attracting Italian art stars to his court that disparaged his daughter-in-law, Catherine de' Medici's patronage because she, quote, gathered family portraits like a grandmother. Well, some of us are working very hard to probe why women particularly treasured portraits, but could we not also say that Catherine innovated by appreciating the immediacy of a medium, drawing, that usually remained in workshops for making replicas? Such delicate drawings cannot be on permanent view and thus remain much less familiar. So scholarship has challenged all these objections, I think, and museum visitors are curious about women's patronage and experience with art. Researchers have defined women's patronage of religious art, seen as consistent with social norms regarding female piety. Women with resources paid for churches, convents, monasteries, and, like Brigida, associated works of art. On screen are examples made for female ecclesiastical sites, some now moved as their original locations were remodeled or destroyed. Vasari's Lives shows that many artists produced works for religious communities supported by patrons of both genders. Vasari admits significantly that he could not always access convent interiors, which may explain his failure to describe things he merely mentions by title. This restriction had a significant impact on art history, as men could readily see and write about paintings decorating male monastic spaces, like, say, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So such works formed part of the art historical canon, while those in female spaces were hidden until convents were suppressed and viewers outside the community could see frescoes like Castagno's Last Supper that is now on the upper right. While we cannot be certain that nuns commissioned every work in their convents, as family members and supporters, also seeking salvation, made gifts. But at San Zaccaria in Venice, at the upper left, Gary Radke outlined the nuns' direct involvement in choices, and we have plenty of other evidence of how nuns themselves viewed works in their midst, which can be communicated to museum visitors. Major museums exhibit nuns and laywomen's commissions from well-known masters. Here are some examples. Visitors view them, however, within displays organized biographically by artists within chronological and geographical frameworks, traditionally used to stress artistic styles and movements. And this is where the itineraries that Noelia has pointed out is going to interrupt that narrative. Some curators deem the encounter with a great work of art sufficient to inspire awe and claim that too much information distracts. Not everyone, though, is equipped to experience artworks with the immediacy they imagine. The public seems hungry for clues to help them gain entry. The Uffizi director recently told me that young visitors stand before displays and use their phones to access information the museum provides. A phone doesn't need to intrude on the viewing experience of others, and unlike an audio guide, can offer several different strands tailored to viewers' curiosity about an artwork's different contexts. One could even articulate women's points of view, for women themselves expressed ideas and their language parallels that found in Vasari. The Franciscan convent of Sant'Antonio in Perugia contracted Raphael, then aged 21, to paint the Madonna and Child on the right. Our next speaker, Cheryl Reese, researches Raphael and his women patrons, but I just want to make a couple of points with this example. Convents sometimes had a public church and another, or a closed-off portion of the main church, reserved for the nuns. In this case, Raphael did see Raphael's work, which he describes in some detail. Remember that Vasari structured his collected lives along a progress model in which art improved over time, culminating in his idol, Michelangelo. Perhaps he found it necessary to explain to his readers that his nun patrons requested that baby Jesus and St. John be clothed, in contrast to another almost contemporary Madonna on the left, Raphael painted for another Perugian church. Vasari notes, moreover, how Raphael gave, quote, the female saints the sweetest and most lovely expressions of countenance and the most beautifully varied headdresses that are anywhere to be seen, a rare thing in these times. He also mentions the beautiful God the Father above, and concludes that this work is, quote, truly marvelous and devout and held in great veneration by those nuns, adding the supreme compliment that the work was, quote, much extolled by all painters. In his progress model, art directed towards enhancing female devotion, made some years before he's writing, perhaps now seemed retardataire. Noting finally that the altarpiece pleased those unassuming and venerable sisters, Vasari hardly condemned the work. Semplici, simple, does not mean simple-minded. It means kind of unaffected. Nevertheless, as Frederica Jacobs, Cheryl Rees, and others have noted, a gendered value system emerged in art theoretical discourse, often resulting in the disparagement of works associated with female taste, a point to which I shall return. The painting with its predella, seen here in reconstruction on the left, remained in situ until 1663, when the nuns went broke. Raphael's fame assured a ready market, and with the bishop's permission, the sisters had the altarpiece sawn up into its component parts so they could be sold piecemeal. The main panel found its way to the Metropolitan Museum. The predella, in turn, belonged to 3 women. Raphael enthusiast Queen Christina of Sweden added it to her extensive collection, later dispersed. Isabella Stewart Gardner purchased the Pietà panel and carefully planned its installation in her Boston house, later museum, seen on the lower right, on a table perpendicular to the window to catch daylight, with a chair placed to allow close personal contemplation. Presumably not for devotion, but to admire Raphael's artistry. For not insignificantly, she was also the first to bring a Raphael to the US in 1898. So here we have a work in which women participated in the creation, collection, and display of this altarpiece or parts of it, as it changed contexts from its original purpose as an aid to devotion to a collectible artwork esteemed by women collectors. One might ask if its female owners grabbed predella panels because they were the only Raphaels available, or did they possibly share an appreciation for these small paintings with their own distinctive styles? Or does that open a Pandora's box of potentially essentialist and deprecatory claims? A neighboring Boston museum acknowledges such a transfer of ownership in a label positioned near a Rubens painting commissioned by Isabel Clara Eugenia, an important protagonist for what is in the Prado and elsewhere in Madrid. This large-scale depiction of a heroic ancient queen fits into the genre of works ruling women frequently ordered. The label notes her commissioning the work and adds the fact that it too passed through the collection of Queen Christina on its journey to its current home. Mrs. Gardner identified with her Renaissance predecessors, collecting as well a Michelangelo drawing connected with Vittoria Colonna and a portrait she thought depicted her namesake, Isabel d'Este, a major patron. Gardner's insistence that the museum she founded retain her installation has been criticized for preventing what are deemed the most significant masterpieces from optimal viewing. The museum found a middle ground in which works are moved temporarily for special exhibitions, like the recent one on Titian's Poesie, while maintaining her overall arrangement, which importantly documents early 20th century ideas about the display of art. Not only are male patrons better known as their names occur in records more than women's, they are also depicted as patrons and connoisseurs, much more. Artworks are visual documents that play a much larger role in how people envisage the past than we probably realize, and I think we need to pay attention. There are numerous illustrations of men interacting with art and artists, but few of women. In Raphael's portrait of Medici Pope Leo X with his nephews, the pontiff fingers a beautiful manuscript, which is identified and is known in the museum, which he could examine with a beautifully crafted lens. The portrait, a large work, was for public view, actually rushed to Florence to substitute for the sitters at the wedding banquet held for the new Duke and Duchess of Urbino. Women also prized exquisitely illuminated manuscripts, but an image like that on the left is small. You can see comparative scale. I reduced the manuscript to its size in the center to compare it with the painting. It's small for private consumption. The early modern era highly valued the small and precious, but conveying that experience presents great challenges for museums. In the 17th century, the Medici, who with the help of Vasari burnished their legend as multi-generational art patrons, commissioned Ottavio Vanini on top to depict a famous story about ancestor Lorenzo the Magnificent. The Medici nurtured young Michelangelo carved a faun. When Lorenzo at center saw it, he advised the youth that it looked too perfect, that a faun should be old. The budding sculptor knocked out a tooth and showed his revised head to Lorenzo, who indicated his approval and thus established his connoisseurial bona fides. At right, as part of a series illustrating his accomplishments as Duke, his descendant, Cosimo I de' Medici, had himself depicted in the company of artists and architects in his employ. And bottom left, in France, where Louis XIV organized much artistic production as an arm of the state, he similarly appears at left, lending his presence to the Gobelin factory. There are fewer large-scale examples of women interacting with art, and I hope that this raises consciousness, and if you know of cases, please share them. In preparatory drawings for tapestries, the ancient widowed queen Artemisia, here representing Catherine de' Medici, actively engages with creatives planning the design of her husband Mausolus's funerary monument. But Catherine is referenced allegorically, not in a portrait. And moreover, she executes an appropriately female role, memorializing her husband. Although these are drawings intended for enlargement into tapestry, none was completed, so this would have been seen by few. Catherine did actually build a great deal, but that activity is not illustrated, and she was criticized for spending so much money. So I guess allegory has its uses. I recently saw a somewhat obscure example in the ephemeral decoration of the facade of the French National Church in Rome, San Luigi dei Francesi, prepared in 1666 on the death of Queen Anne of Austria, daughter of Philip III and widow of Louis XIII. The panel on the lower right commemorated her patronage of the Val-de-Grâce convent in Paris, erected in gratitude for the birth of the future Louis XIV. It was also her refuge from the court, for royal and noble women often had apartments in convents they supported, as at the Descalzas Reales and Encarnacion here, supported by Anna's relatives. The Palacio Real exhibition 2 years ago made clear how convents functioned as alternative female-centered courts, while also exhibiting the kinds of objects women valued: elaborate reliquaries in precious materials, small devotional images, and family portraits. Once again, objects that can be challenging to present and interpret in an art museum. Unusual is Sperandio's depiction of Archduchess Caterina Gonzaga of the Tyrol supervising construction of the Servite convent in Innsbruck. One of her ladies' gestures stresses the complex's dedication to the Virgin. This too conforms to expectations for female patronage, making clear that the impetus is not self-directed. Another category of visual record propagates the idea that collecting and connoisseurship are male domains. Gentlemen aficionados gather socially to examine their treasures. The message is clear. Wealthy men accumulate precious objects and show them off to friends in a shared but competitive culture. Antwerp artists in particular painted men engaging with artists and artworks, some showing off their own collections, others visiting collections of recognizable masterpieces, while still others were fantasies. David Teniers painted the collection of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm of Austria, the younger brother of Emperor Ferdinand III, several times, and one example is here in the Prado, a gift from the Archduke to his uncle, Philip IV. While the Archduke had no spouse, his stepmother, Empress Eleonora Gonzaga, raised in Mantua with its impressive patrimony, influenced his interest in collecting. But the images do not reflect her contribution. The single protagonist's role as patron and collector makes a much more compelling narrative. And in fact, many married couples and family members acted together to build and collect for their dynasties, but their joint efforts are not always recognized as such. I'm on the lookout for images showing women engaged with artworks, and I've found a few, I think, that are not allegorical. And I hope I'm not dipping into materials that later speakers will be talking about. But here we have Archduke Albert and Isabel gracing a private collection with their presence, and some other women are also present. This painting is loaded with allegorical references to their benevolent reign, but Isabella largely sits majestically, not directly engaging with the collection. Collectors valued visits by dignitaries, but such visitors were primarily male. Naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi in Bologna kept a guest book, you can see a page of it there in the center, and he carefully noted the profession and status of his callers, and on the right is a transcription into English by Paula Finland. Now, while it is possible that certain of the groups he lists included women, the fact that he provides there at the bottom the category woman suggests that female visitors were the exception, and also that there was no other classification to which they could be assigned. Time does not permit a thorough analysis of much that scholars have pointed out as significant in Van Heek's depiction of another gallery visited by the archdukes and other art world VIPs. Significantly here, note that Isabel Clara Eugenia on the left does actually engage with artworks. But in their zeal to identify major objects depicted, and on the upper right you can see a key to this painting with numbers on a lot of the paintings. But if you look at the detail that represents the portion where Isabel and Albert are sitting, there are no numbers by her, okay? Everybody see that? They've ignored what Isabel Clara Eugenia actually holds in this case, which is a small Ambroise Bochert-like still life in her lap, while the page presents a small bronze Cupid. And I think there's certainly some intriguing conclusions to draw about these choices. Perhaps inspired by one such depiction decorating her workroom at Kew Palace near London, and note in this one, a woman does appear, but hardly engaged with the art. She's holding on to a child. As a result, perhaps, of her familiarity with this painting, Queen Charlotte sent Johann Zoffany off to paint the famous Medici collection in Florence as a gift for her husband, George III, which resulted in a famous work, the Tribuna of the Uffizi, illustrating the space renowned for displaying the collection's highlights. In the 18th century, of course, Italy was the ne plus ultra for English connoisseurs in the making. Queen Charlotte, it seems, was displeased with Zoffany's result, finding it overly crowded with portraits of people who didn't matter. But more significantly for today's themes, Zoffany took liberties with the paintings on display in the Tribuna, placing a famous Titian in the foreground. Now, many issues of gender can emerge in relation to this painting, but the point I wish to make concerns how the Venus of Urbino got to the Medici collection. While women may not have exerted agency over their marriages, dowries, and associated transfers of property, dynastic matrimonial practice meant that assets moved between courts. Although the Pope prevented her inheriting the Duchy of Urbino itself, Vittoria della Rovere, only child of its rulers, brought 57 artworks from her family patrimony, including familiar Piero della Francesca's, Raphael's, and Titian's, to her marriage to Grand Duke Ferdinand II. She had nothing to do with their patronage, but neither did her Medici husband. When dowries did not include artworks, husbands used the cash infusion from their wives to form collections that then bore their own names. But some women likewise benefited from amassing wealth through marriage that enabled their collection. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Electress Palatine, returned to Florence when widowed and represents the flip side of this coin. As her brother Gian Gastone had no heir, after political wrangling, Tuscany passed to the House of Lorraine in the person of Francis I at the lower left, husband of Empress Maria Theresa. The Electress managed to arrange for Medici patrimony to remain in Florence. Imagine if the Uffizi and Pitti collections had either been sold or moved to Vienna, which could have happened. The museum should actually be named in her honor. Earlier, I analyzed some language Vasari used regarding Raphael's altarpiece. And I wanted now to share just a couple of examples of women who clearly demonstrated their being conversant with the terms. As Renaissance women frequently outlived men, widows regularly commissioned funerary chapels and tombs within churches. Rights to chapels were bought, often for limited periods, and could be resold to different individuals who wanted their own decorations. So churches often had artworks to sell. That is one reason why works by well-known painters like these now on the screen, commissioned by women and painted for religious contexts, now hang in museums. The altarpiece at center, painted by Francesco Francia of Bologna for a female member of the Manzoli family, typifies what was called the devout style, as explicated by the late Charles Dempsey. Perugino and Raphael, before he absorbed the Lescans of Tuscany, also excelled in works reflecting this style, as Vasari noted in his description of Raphael's altarpiece discussed above. The stile devoto coexisted with the Michelangelo-inspired style that Vasari typically advocated, and resulted in a polemic that also began to involve geography, Bologna versus Florence, and gender, for the devout style also became associated with female artists. Alessandra Macigni Strozzi, a Florentine widow managing her family's affairs, wrote her son in Bruges in 1460 about objects he sent her. She says of one painting, "The holy face, possibly something like the one on the right, I will keep, for it is a devout figure and beautiful." Creighton Gilbert suggested her use of devout and beautiful, quote, showed awareness of both symbolic and aesthetic qualities independent of each other. By separating these aspects, Gilbert echoed sentiments ascribed to Michelangelo about Flemish painting, which he supposedly said, quote, appeals to women, especially to the very old and the very young, and also to monks and nuns. The implication is clear. Art that appeals to emotions rather than reason, as they would have constructed it, cannot be beautiful. But the Counter-Reformation, whose exponents advocated for art's role in inspiring devotion, returned the devout style to favor, and 17th century Bolognese art theoreticians readily agreed. Another word that Vasari and other Renaissance writers about art use is judgment. As the word connoisseurship was not an early modern term, judgment most directly applies to the evaluation of the quality of artworks. We have a nice coincidence of this large altarpiece painting that Vasari himself made for the Florentine convent of the Murate. Sister Giustina Nicolini, who wrote the convent memoirs, said, "In 1546, when Sister Faustina Vitelli made her profession, she gave the convent a painting of the Last Supper made by Giorgino Aretino." He was from Arezzo, that's what they called him. One of the most celebrated masters in Florence at the time. His work was always judged, not only by us, but also by the judicious people of quality who had seen it to be as beautiful and rare as any other in Florence. Vasari's large work, a casualty of the 1966 floods that languished thereafter, finally receiving conservation treatment, is now on display in Santa Croce. Observe Nicolini's calling attention to the opinion of astute people of quality who affirm the nun's own views of the painting's merits. Now, many of the Murate community came from elite Florentine families, so we can assume a level of education that they had. Well, we've come a long way from initial forays into women's activities as patrons and collectors, and I look forward to the next steps in making early modern women's voices heard and experienced valorized. Although I've concentrated mostly on Italian examples, with the numbers of Trastamara and Habsburg women, not to mention legions of noble women and religious in Spain, the Prado is in an ideal position to carry this forward. Thank you.